Hello, everybody. Welcome to Peter Reads Books. This is a slightly rushed podcast because I had the great idea yesterday after work. As you may know, I work in a bar that closes at 3. So at 3:30, me and my coworker went to a friend and had a glass of wine after work. So I got to bed like an hour ago-ish, couple of hours maybe. Um, so that's good. I've had the luxury of several hours of sleep. But podcast going up, I wrecked it last time. But today we're gonna go for it. We're just gonna read this. I haven't read this either. But so far the story goes that in the Riders of the Purple Sage, Jane Withersteen is the female protagonist. She's a Mormon. She's never married. She inherited a lot of land and a lot of stuff from her father. Most importantly, the well or the spring that gives water to all the Mormon peoples. And she's very, very kind. She's excessively nice, actually. She's very, very obviously the good guy. And then she has sort of more or less fallen in love with Ventus, who's not a Mormon, and he's sort of slightly stupid, but a good guy at heart. And then there's Lassiter, who came in and saved Ventus when the Mormons Toll, the head of activities in Mormon land, wanted to kill Ventus or to drag him away. Lassiter came in, and he's sort of a Mormon killer, a gunman, a gunslinger, and he just randomly came in at exactly the most opportune moment, which was nice. Which it helped get the story along quite a bit. So, but Jane Withersteen's herd of cattle has been stolen from her by a guy called Oldring, who hides in Deception Pass, and he's quite obviously not a good guy. And he had a masked rider, and when who was his second in command essentially, when the red herd was stolen, Ventus went to Deception Pass to track them, and he found them. They came in through this maze of passages through a waterfall, and Ventus found the masked rider and some other bloke that he shot dead, except for the rider, who he found out was the masked one was not quite dead. She was a woman, and he felt bad about it and tried to save her. And we don't know who it was. The only person we know of who hasn't appeared yet, that we've been told of, is Millie Ern's daughter or child. So that might be her. Millie Ern is a friend of Jane Withersteen, and Lassiter has sought out Jane Withersteen because of Millie Ern, because she died, and he wants to know where she's buried and what happened to her. He might be the father of Millie Ern's child, we hear. Then later, when after Lassiter's seen the grave and all that, more of Jane's herds disappear, and the riders are not returning to her. So she's kind of being ousted. It's a kind of coup. People are trying to steal away her entire world. Lassiter, when they go and see that the herd is being one of the herds is being stampeded by some people, Lassiter rides in and tries to change this. Tries to stop them from stampeding, and he succeeds, but his horse, his blind horse, dies from it. And then he says that he wants to kill the people who have stampeded them, who are quite obviously her Mormon peers, and she's very sad because suddenly she realizes that this Lasseter guy might not be all that nice that she thought. She's been very kind to him and liked him quite a bit so far, but yeah. I am just trying to get this. There we go. To get the document to auto scroll so I can read. I am gonna fuck up the accents so hard. But anyway, chapter 7, the daughter of Witherstein. Lasseter, will you be my rider? Jane had asked him. I reckon so, he had replied. Few as the words were, Jane knew how infinitely much they implied. She wanted him to take charge of her cattle and horse and ranges and save them if that was possible, if that were possible. Yet though she could not have spoken aloud all she meant, she was perfectly honest with herself. Whatever the price to be paid, she must keep Lasseter close to her. She must shield him from the man who had led Million to Cottonwoods. In her fear, she so controlled her mind that she did not whisper this Mormon's name to her own soul. She did not even think it. Besides, beyond this thing she regarded as a sacred obligation thrust upon her, was the need of a helper, of a friend, of a champion in this critical time. She could rule, if she could rule this gunman, as Ventus had called him, if she could even keep him from shedding blood, what strategy to play his flame and his presence against the game of oppression from a churchman what strategy to play his flame and presence against the game of oppression her churchmen were waging against her. Never would she forget the effect on Tull and his men when Ventus shouted Lasseter's name. If she could not wholly control Lasseter, then what she could do might put off the fatal day. One of her safe races was a dark bay, and she called him Bells because of the way he struck his iron shoes on the stones. When Gerd led out this slender, beautifully built horse, Lasseter suddenly became all eyes. A rider's love of a thoroughbred shone in them. Round and round Bells he walked, plainly weakening all the time in his determination not to take one of Jane's favored races. Lasseter, you're half horse, and Bells sees it already, Jane said, laughing. Look at his eyes. He likes you. He'll love you too. How can you resist him? Oh, Lasseter, but Bells can run. It's nip and tuck between him and Rankle, and only Blankstar can beat him. He's too spirited a horse for a woman. Take him. He's yours. Just in weak where a horse concerned, said Lasseter. I'll take him, and I'll take your orders, ma'am. Well, I'm glad, but never mind the ma'am. Let us still be Jane. From that hour, it seemed, Lasseter was always in the saddle, riding early and late, and coincident with his part in Jane's affairs, the days assumed their old tranquility. Her intelligence told her this was only the lull before the storm, but her faith would not have it so. She resumed her visits to the village, and upon one of these she encountered Tull. He greeted her as he had before any trouble came between them, and she, responsive to peace, if not quick to forget, met him halfway with manner almost cheerful. He regretted the loss of her cattle. He assured her that the vigilantes, which had been organized, would soon rout the rustlers. When that had been accomplished, her riders would likely return to her. You've done a headstrong thing to hire this man Lasseter, Tull went on severely. He came to Cottonwoods with evil intent. I had to have somebody, and perhaps making him my rider may turn out best in the end for the Mormons of Cottonwoods. You mean to stay his hand? I do, if I can. A woman like you can do anything with a man. That will be well, and would atone in some measures for the errors you have made. He bowed and passed on. Jane resumed her walk with conflicting thoughts. She resented Elder Tull's cold, impassive manner that looked down upon her as one who had incurred his just displeasure. Otherwise, he would have been the same calm, dark-browed, impenetrable man she had known for 10 years. In fact, When he had revealed his passion in the matter of seizing Ventus, she had never dreamed he could be any other. She had never dreamed he could be any other than the grave, reproving preacher. He stood out now, a strange, secretive man. She would have thought better of him if he had picked up the threads of their quarrel where they had parted. Was Tull what he appeared to be? The question itself, the question flung itself involuntarily over Jane Withersteen's inhibitive habit of faith without question, and she refused to answer it. Tull could not fight in the open. Ventus had said, Lassiter had said that her elder shirked fight and worked in the dark. Just now in this meeting, Tull had ignored the fact that he had sued, exhorted, demanded that she marry him. He had made no mention of Ventus. His manner was that of the minister who had been His manner was that of the minister who had been outraged, but who overlooked the frailties of a woman. Beyond question, he seemed unutterably aloof from all knowledge of pressure being brought to bear upon her, absolutely guiltless of any connection with secret power over riders, with night journeys, with rustlers and stampedes of cattle. And that convinced her again of unjust suspicions. But it was convincement through an obstinate faith. She shuddered as she accepted it, and that shudder was the nucleus of a terrible revolt. Jane turned into one of the wide lanes leading from the main street and entered a huge, shady yard. Here were sweet-smelling clover, alfalfa flowers, vegetables, all growing in happy confusion. And like these fresh green things were the dozens of babies, tots, toddlers, noisy urchins, laughing girls, and a whole multitude of children of one family. For Collier Brandt, the father of all this numerous progeny, was a Mormon with 4 wives. The big house where they lived was old, solid, picturesque, the lower part built of logs, the upper part of rough clapboards, with vines growing up the outside stone chimneys. There were many wooden-shuttered windows and one pretentious window of glass, proudly curtained in white. As this house had 4 mistresses, it likewise had 4 separate sections, not one of which communicated with the other, and all had to be entered from the outside. In the shade of a wide, low, vine-roofed porch, Jane found Brandt's wives entertaining. In the shade of a wide, low, vine-roofed porch. In the shade of a wide, low, vine-roofed porch, Jane found Brandt's wives entertaining Bishop Dyer. They were motherly women of comparatively similar ages and plain-featured, and just at this moment anything but grave. The bishop was rather tall, of stout build, with iron grey hair and beard and eyes of light blue. They were merry now, but Jane had seen them when they were not, and she feared him as she had feared her father. The women flocked around her in welcome. "Daughter of Withersteen," said the bishop gaily as he took her hand, "you have not been prodigal in your gracious self of late. You have not been prodigal of your gracious self of late. A Sabbath without you at service. I shall reprove Elder Tull." "Bishop, the guilt is mine. I'll come to you and confess," Jane replied lightly, but she felt the undercurrent of her words. "Mormon love-making," exclaimed the bishop, rubbing his hand. "Tull keeps you all to himself." "No, he's not courting me." "What? The laggard. If he does not make haste, I'll go a-courting myself up to Withersteen House." There was a laughter and a further bantering by the bishop, and then mild talk of village affairs, after which he took his leave, and Jane was left with her friend, Mary Brandt. "Jane, you are not yourself. Are you sad about the rustling of the cattle? But you have so many. You are so rich." Then Jane confided in her, telling her much, yet holding back her doubts of fear. "Oh, why don't you marry Tull and be one of us?" "But Mary, I don't love Tull," said Jane stubbornly. "I don't blame you for that. But Jane Withersteen, you've got to choose between the love of a man and love of God. Often we Mormon women have to do that. It's not easy. The kind of happiness you want, I wanted once. I never got it, nor will you, unless you throw away your soul. We've all watched your affair with Ventus in fear and trembling. Some dreadful thing will come of it. You don't want him hanged or shot or treated worse as that Gentile boy which was treated in Glaze for fooling around a Mormon woman. Marry Tull. It is your duty as a Mormon. You'll feel no rapture as his wife, but think of heaven. Mormon women don't marry for what they expect on earth. Take up the cross, Jane. Remember your fathers found Amber Spring, built these old houses, brought Mormons here, and fathered them. You are the daughter of Withersteen. Jane left Mary Brandt and went to call upon other friends. They received her with the same glad welcome as had Mary, lavished upon her the pent-up affection of Mormon women, and let her go with ears ringing of Tull Vence's Lassiter, of duty to God and glory in heaven. Verily, murmured Jane, I do not know myself, when through all this I remain unchanged, nay, more fixed of purpose. She returned to the main street and bent her thoughtful steps towards the center of the village. A string of wagons, drawn by oxen, was lumbering along. These sage freighters, as they were called, hauled grain and flour and merchandise from Stirling, and Jane laughed suddenly in the midst of her humility at the thought that they were her property, as was one of the 3 stores for which they freighted goods. The water that flowed along the path at her feet and turned into each cottage yard to nourish garden and orchard also was hers, no less her private property because she chose to give it free. Yet in this village of Cottonwoods, which her father had founded and which she maintained, she was not her own mistress. She was not able to abide by her own choice of a husband. She was the daughter of Withersteen. Suppose she proved it imperiously, but she quelled that proud temptation at its birth. Nothing could have replaced the affection which the village people had for her. No power could have made her happy as the pleasure of her. No power could have made her happy as the pleasure her presence gave. As she went down the street past the stores with their rude platform entrances and the saloons where tired horses stood with bridles dragging, she was again assured of what was the bread and wine of life to her, that she was loved. Dirty boys playing in the ditch, clerks, teamsters, riders, loungers on the corners, ranches on dusty horses, little girls running errands, and women hurrying to the stores all looked up at her coming with glad eyes. Jane's various calls and wandering steps at length led her to the Gentile quarter of the village. This was at the extreme southern end, and here some 30 Gentile families lived in huts, shacks, and log cabins, and several dilapidated cottages. The fortunes of these inhabitants of Cottonwoods could be read in their abodes. Water they had in abundance, and therefore grass and fruit trees and patches of alfalfa and vegetable gardens. Some of these men and boys had a few stray cattle. Others obtained such intermittent employment as the Mormons reluctantly tendered them. But none of the families were prosperous. Many were very poor, and some lived only by Jane Withersteen's beneficence. As it made Jane happy to go among her own people, so it saddened her to come in contact with these Gentiles. Yet that was not because she was unwelcome. Here she was gratefully received by the women, passionately led by the children. But the poverty and idleness with their attendant wretchedness and sorrow always hurt her. That she could alleviate this distress more now than ever before proved their age that it was an ill wind that blew nobody good. People are calling me. I'm not going to be able to answer that. That she could alleviate this distress more now than ever. Okay, it's annoying. I hope you can't hear that, actually. It's just buzzing. That she could alleviate this distress more now than ever before proved their days that it was an ill wind that blew nobody good. While her Mormon riders were in her employ, she had found few Gentiles who would stay with her, and now she was able to find employment for all the men and boys. No little shock was it to have man after man tell her that he dare not accept her kind offer. "It won't do," said one Carson, an intelligent man who had seen better days. "We've had our warning, plain and to the point. Now there's Judkins. He packs guns and he can use them, and so can the daredevil boys he's hired. But they've little responsibility. Can we risk having our homes burned in our absence? Jane felt the stretching and chilling of the skin of her face as the blood left it. Carson, you and the others rent these houses, he asked. You ought to know, Miss Withersteen. Some of them are yours. I know, Carson. I never in my life took a day's labor for rent or a yearling calf for a bunch of grass, let alone gold. Bevan, your storekeeper sees to that. Look here, Carson, went on Jane hurriedly, and now her cheeks were burning. You and Black and Willett pack your goods and move your families up to my cabins in the grove. They're far more comfortable than these. Then go to work for me, and if aught happens to you there, I'll give you money, gold enough to leave Utah. The man choked and stammered, and then, as tears welled into his eyes, he found the use of his tongue and cursed. No gentle speech could ever have equaled that curse and eloquent expression of what he felt for Jane Withersteen. How strangely his look and tone reminded her of Lassiter. No, it won't do, he said, when he had somewhat recovered himself. Miss Withersteen, there are things that you do not know, and there is not a soul among us who can tell you. I seem to be learning many things, Carson. Well, then, will you let me aid you, say, till better times? Yes, I will, he replied, with his face lighting up. I see what it means to you, and you know what it means to me. Thank you. And if better times ever come, I'll be only too happy to work for you. Better times will come. I trust God and have faith in man. Good day, Carson. The lane opened out upon the sage-enclosed alfalfa fields, and the last habitation at the end of the lane of Howells was the meanest. Hang on. The lane opened out upon the sage-enclosed alfalfa fields, and the last habitation at the end of that lane of Howells was the meanest. Formerly it had been a shed. Now it was a home. The broad leaves of wide-spreading cottonwood sheltered the sunken roof of weathered boards. Like an Indian hut, it had one floor. Round about it were a few scanty rows of vegetables, such as the hand of weak women had time and strength to cultivate. This little dwelling place was just outside the village limits, and the widow who lived there had to carry her water from the nearest irrigation ditch. As Jane Withersteen entered this unfenced yard, a child saw her, shrieked with joy, and came tearing towards her with curls flying. This child was a little girl of 4 called Fay. Her name suited her, for she was an elf, a sprite, a creature so fairy-like and beautiful that she seemed unearthly. More sent for you, cried Fay as Jane kissed her. And who never told? I didn't know, Fay, but I've come now. Fay was a child of outdoors, of the garden and ditch and fields, and she was dirty and ragged. But rags and dirt did not hide her beauty. The one thin, little, bedraggled garment she wore half covered her fine, slim body. Red as cherries were her cheeks and lips, her eyes were violet blue, and the crown of her childish loveliness was a curling golden hair. All the children of Cottonwoods were Jane Withersteen's friends. She loved them all, but Fay was dearest to her. Fay had few playmates, for among the Gentile children there were none near her age, and the Mormon children were forbidden to play with her. So she was a shy, wild, lonely child. Mother's sick, said Fay, leading Jane towards the door of the hut. Jane went in. There was only one room, rather dark and bare, but it was clean and neat. A woman lay upon a bed. Mrs. Larkin, how are you? Asked Jane anxiously. Oh, that should be all different then. Miss Larkin, how are you? Asked Jane anxiously. I've been pretty bad for a week, but I'm better now. You haven't been here all alone, with no one to wait on you? Oh, no. My women neighbors are kind. They take turns coming in. Did you send for me? Yes, several times. But I had no word. No messages ever got to me. I sent the boys, and they left word with your women that I was ill, and would you please come? Sudden deadly sickness seized Jane. She fought the weakness as she fought to be above suspicious thoughts. And it passed, leaving her conscious of her utter impotence. That too passed as her spirit rebounded. But she had again caught a glimpse of dark underhand domination, running its secret lines this time into her own household. Like a spider in the blackness of night, an unseen hand had begun to run these dark lines, to turn and twist them about her life, to plait and weave a web. Jane Withersteen knew it now, and in the realization, further coolness and sureness came to her, and the fighting courage of her ancestors. Mrs. Larkin, you're better, and I'm so glad, said Jane. But may I not do something for you? A turn at nursing, or send you things, or take care of Faye? You're so good. Since my husband has been gone, since my husband's been gone, what would have become of Faye and me, but for you? It was about Faye that I wanted to speak to you. This time I surely thought I'd die, and I was worried about Faye. Well, I'll be around all right shortly, but my strength's gone, and I won't live long, so I may as well speak now. You remember you've been asking me to let you take Faye and bring her up as your daughter. Indeed, yes, I remember. I'll be happy to have her, but I hope the day... Never mind that. The day'll come sooner or later. I refused your offer, and now I'll tell you why. I know why, interposed Jane. It's because you don't want her brought up as a Mormon. No, it wasn't altogether that. Mrs. Larkin raised her thin hand and laid it appealingly on Jane's. I don't like to tell you, but it's this. I told all my friends what you wanted. They know you, care for you, and they said for me to trust Faye upon you. Women will talk, you know. I got the ears of Mormons, gossip of your love for Faye and your wanting her, and it came straight back to me, in jealousy perhaps, that you wouldn't take Faye as much for love of her as because of your religious duty to bring up another girl for some Mormon to marry. That's a damnable lie, cried Jane Withersteen. It was what made me hesitate, went on Miss Larkin, but I never believed it at heart, and now I guess I'll let you... Wait, Miss Larkin. Mrs. Larkin, I may have told little white lies in my life, but never a lie that mattered, that hurt anyone. Now believe me, I love little Faye. If I had her near me, I'd grow to worship her. When I asked for her, I thought only of that love. Let me prove this. You and Faye come to live with me. I have such a big house, and I'm so lonely. I will help nurse you, take care of you. When you're better, you can work for me. I'll keep little Faye and bring her up without Mormon teaching. When she's grown, if she should want to leave me, I'll send her, and not empty-handed, back to Illinois, where you came from. I promise you. I knew it was a lie, replied the mother, and she sank back upon her pillow with something of peace in her white, worn face. Jane Withersteen, may heaven bless you. I've been deeply grateful to you, but because you're a Mormon, I never felt close to you till now. I don't know much about religion, but your God and my God are the same. That's the end of that chapter. She's very Disney princess-like, Jane Withersteen. Just all the children just run to her when she walks through the village. It's just, this is the first person who has anything against her, this mother woman. But it's just, not even that. It's just not anything but kindness and maybe a slight misunderstanding. Let's see. I think we're going to go back to Ventus now, and I think I forgot to mention that he has gone. He's still in Deception Pass with the Masked Rider girl that she hasn't. I can't remember her name. I don't think we heard it, but he's trying to nurse her back to health. Chapter 8: Surprise Valley. Back in that strange canyon, which Ventus had found indeed a valley of surprises, the wounded girl's whispered appeal, almost a prayer not to take her back to the rustlers, crowned the events of the last few days with a confounding climax. That she should not want to return to them staggered Ventus. Presently, as logical thought returned, her appeal confirmed his first impressions, that she was more unfortunate than bad, and he experienced a sensation of gladness. If he had known before that Aldring's Masked Rider was a woman, his opinion would have been formed, and he would have considered her abandoned. But his first knowledge had come when he lifted a white face quivering in convulsion of agony. He had heard God's name whispered by blood-stained lips. Through her solemn and awful eyes he had caught a glimpse of her soul, and just now had come the entreaty to him, "Don't take me back there." Once, for Wence's quick mind Once for all, Vence's quick mind formed a permanent conception of this poor girl. He based it not upon what the chances of life had made her, but upon the revelation of dark eyes that pierced the infinite, upon a few pitiful, halting words that portrayed failure and wrong and misery, yet breathed the truth of a tragic fate rather than a natural leaning to evil. "What's your name?" he inquired. "Bess," she answered. "Bess what?" "That's enough. Just Bess." The red that deepened in her cheek was not all the flush of fever. Ventus marveled anew, and this time at the tint of shame in her face, at the momentary drooping of long lashes. She might be a restless girl, but she was still capable of shame. She might be dying, but she still clung to some little remnant of honor. "Very well, Bess. It doesn't matter," he said, "but this matters. What shall I do with you?" "Are you a rider?" "Not now. I was once. I drove the Witherstein herds, but I lost my place, lost all I owned, and now I am sort of an outcast. My name is Burn Ventus." "You won't take me to Cottonwoods or Glaze? I'd be hanged." "No, indeed. But I must do something with you, for it's not safe for me here. I shot that rustler who was with you. Sooner or later he'll be found, and then my tracks. I must find a safer hiding place where I can't be trailed." "Leave me here." "Alone? To die?" "Yes, I will not." Ventus spoke shortly with a kind of ring in his voice. "What do you want to do with me?" Difficult, so low and faint that Ventus had to stoop to hear. "Why, let's see," he replied slowly. "I'd like to take you someplace where I could watch by you, nurse you till you're all right. And then?" "Well, it'll be time to think of that when you're cured of your wound. It's a bad one, and, Bess, if you don't want to live, if you don't fight for your life, you'll never—" "Oh, I want to live. I'm afraid to die, but I'd rather die than go back to Aldring?" asked Ventus, interrupting her in turn. Her lips moved in an affirmative. "I promise not to take you back to him, or to Cottonwoods, or to Glaze." The mournful earnestness of her gaze suddenly shone with an unutterable gratitude and wonder. And as suddenly Ventus found her eyes beautiful as he had never seen or felt beauty. They were as dark blue as the sky at night. Then the flashing changed to a long, thoughtful look, in which there was a wistful, unconscious searching of his face, a look that trembled on the verge of hope and trust. "I'll try to live," she said. The broken whisper just reached his ears. "Do what you want with me. Rest then." "Rest then. Don't worry. Sleep," he replied. Abruptly he rose as if words had been a decision for him. With a sharp command to the dogs, he strode from the camp. Ventus was conscious of an indefinite conflict of change within him. It seemed to be a vague passing of old moods, a dim coalescing of new forces, a movement of inexplicable transition. He was both cast down and uplifted. He wanted to think of the meaning, but he resolutely dispelled emotion. His imperative need at present was to find a safe retreat, and this called for action. So he set out. It still wanted several hours before dark. This trip he turned to the left and wended his skulking way southward a mile or more to the opening of the valley where lay the strange scrawled rocks. He did not, however, venture boldly out into the open sage, but clung to the right-hand wall and went along that till its perpendicular line broke into the long incline of bare stone. Before proceeding farther, he halted, studying the strange character of this slope and realizing that a moving black object could be seen far against such background. Before him ascended a gradual swell of smooth stone. It was hard, polished, and full of pockets worn by centuries of eddying rainwater. 100 yards up began a line of grotesque cedar trees, and they extended along the slope, clear to its most southerly end. Beyond that end, Ventus wanted to get, and he concluded the cedars, few as they were, would afford some cover. Therefore, he climbed swiftly. The trees were farther up than he had estimated, though he had from long habit made allowance for the deceiving nature of distances in that country. When he gained the cover of cedars, he paused to rest and look, and it was then he saw how the trees sprang from holes in the bare rock. Ages of rain had run down the slope, circling, eddying in depressions, wearing deep round holes. There had been dry seasons, accumulations of dust, wind-blown seeds, and cedars rose wonderfully out of solid rock. But these were not beautiful cedars. They were gnarled, twisted into weird contortions, as if growth were torture, dead at the tops, shrunken, grey, and old. Theirs had been a bitter fight, and Ventus felt a strange sympathy for them. This country was hard on trees and men. He slipped from cedar to cedar, keeping them between him and the open valley as he progressed. The belt of trees widened, and he kept to its upper margin. He passed shady pockets of half-full water, and as he marked the location for possible future need, he reflected that there had been no rain since the winter snows. From one of these shady holes, a rabbit hopped out and squatted down, laying its ears flat. Ventus wanted fresh meat now more than when he had only himself to think of. But it would not do to fire his rifle there, so he broke off a cedar. Let's try again. So he broke off a cedar branch and threw it. He crippled the rabbit, which started to flounder up the slope. Ventus did not wish to lose the meat, and he never allowed crippled game to escape, to die lingeringly in some covert. So after a careful glance below and back towards the canyon, he began to chase the rabbit. The fact that rabbits generally ran uphill was not new to him, but it presently seemed singular why this rabbit, that might have escaped downwards, chose to ascend the slope. Ventus knew then that it had a burrow higher up. More than once he jerked over to seize it, only in vain, for the rabbit, by renewed effort, eluded his grasp. Thus the chase continued on up the bare slope. The farther Ventus climbed, the more determined he grew to catch his quarry. At last, panting and sweating, he captured the rabbit at the foot of a steeper grade. Laying his rifle on the bulge of rising stone, he killed the animal and slung it from his belt. Before starting down, he waited to catch his breath. He had climbed far up that wonderful smooth slope and had almost reached the base of yellow cliff that rose skyward, a huge, scarred and cracked bulk. It frowned down upon him as if to forbid further ascent. Ventus bent over for his rifle, and as he picked it up from where it leaned against the steeper grade, he saw several little nicks cut in the solid stone. They were only a few inches deep and about a foot apart. Ventus began to count them. 1, 2, 3, 4, on up to 16. That number carried his lance to the top of his first bulging bench of cliff base. Above, a more level offset was still steeper slope, and the line of nicks kept on to wind round a projecting corner of wall. A casual glance would have passed by these little dents. A casual glance would have passed by these little dents. If Ventus had not known what they signified, he would never have bestowed upon them the second glance. But he knew that they had been cut there by hand, and though age-worn, he recognized them as steep steps cut in the rocks by the cliff dwellers. With a pulse beginning to beat and hammer away his calmness, he eyed that indistinct line of steps up to where the buttress of wall hid further side of them. He knew that behind the corner of stone would be a cave or a crack which could never be suspected from below. Chance that had sported with him of late now directed him into probable hiding place. Chance that had sported with him of late now directed him to a probable hiding place. Again, he laid aside his rifle and removing boots and belts, he began to walk up the steps. Like a mountain goat, he was agile, sure-footed, and he mounted the first bench without bending to use his hands. The next ascent took grip of fingers as well as toes, but he climbed steadily, swiftly to reach the projecting corner and slipped around it. Here he faced a notch in the cliff. At the apex, he turned abruptly into a ragged vent that split the ponderous wall clear to the top, showing a narrow streak of blue sky. At the base, this vent was dark, cool, and smelled of dry, musty dust. It zigzagged so that he could not see ahead more than a few yards at a time. He noticed tracks of wildcats and rabbits in the dusty floor. At every turn, he expected to come upon a huge cavern full of little square stone houses, each with a little each with a small aperture like a staring eye. The passage widened and opened at the foot of a narrow, steep ascending chute. Ventus had a moment's notice of the rock, which was the same smoothness and hardness as the slope below, before his gaze went irresistibly upwards to the precipitous walls of this wide ladder of granite. These were ruined walls of yellow sandstone, and so split and splintered, so overhanging with great sections of balancing rim, so impending with tremendous crumbling cracks that Ventus caught his breath sharply, and, appalled, he instinctively recoiled as if a step upwards might jar the ponderous cliffs from their foundations. Indeed, it seemed that these ruined cliffs were but awaiting a breath of wind to collapse and come tumbling down. Ventus hesitated. It would be a foolhardy man who risked his life under the leaning, waiting avalanches of rock in that gigantic spill. Yet how many years had they leaned there without falling? At the bottom of the incline was an immense heap of weathered sandstone, all crumbling to dust, but there were no huge rocks as large as houses, such as rested so lightly and frightfully above, waiting patiently and inevitably to crash down. Slowly split from the parent rock by the weathering process and carved and sculptured by ages of wind and rain, they waited their moment. Ventus felt how foolish it was for him to fear these broken walls, to fear that after they had endured for thousands of years, the moment of his passing should be the one for them to slip. Sorry about that sudden S word. Yet he feared it. What a place to hide, muttered Ventus. I'll climb. I'll see where this thing goes. If only I can find water. With teeth tight shut, he essayed the incline. And as he climbed, he bent his eyes downward. This, however, after a little grew impossible. He had to look to obey his anger. This, however, after a little grew impossible. He had to look to obey his eager, curious mind. He raised his glance and saw light between row and row of shafts and pinnacles and cracks that stood out from the main wall. Some leaned against the cliff, others against each other. Many stood sheer and alone. All were crumbling, cracked, rotten. It was a place of yellow, ragged ruin. The passage narrowed as he went up. It became a slant, hard for him to stick on. It was smooth as marble. Finally, he surmounted it, surprised to find the wall still several 100 feet high and a narrow gorge leading down on the other side. This was a divide between two inclines, about 20 yards wide. At one side stood an enormous rock. Ventus gave it a second glance because it rested on a pedestal. It attracted closer attention. It was like a colossal pear of stone standing on its stem. Around the bottom were thousands of little nicks, just distinguishable to the eye. They were marks of stone hatchets. The cliff dwellers had chipped and chipped away at this boulder till it rested its tremendous bulk on a mere pinpoint of its surface. Ventus pondered. Why had the little stone men hacked away at that big boulder? It bore no semblance to a statue or an idol or a godhead or a sphinx. Instinctively, he put his hand on it and pushed. Then his shoulder and heaved. This stone seemed to groan, to stir, to grate, and then to move. It tipped a little downwards and hung balancing for a long instant, slowly returned, rocked slightly, groaned, and settled back to its former position. Ventus divines its significance. It had been meant for defense. The cliff dwellers, driven by dreaded enemies to this last stand, had cunningly cut the rock until it balanced perfectly, ready to be dislodged by strong hands. Just below it leaned a tottering crag that would have toppled, starting an avalanche on an acclivity where no sliding mass could stop. Cracks and pinnacles, splintered cliffs, and leaning shafts and monuments would have thundered down to block forever the outlet to Deception Pass. That was a narrow shave for me, said Ventus soberly. A balancing rock. The cliff dwellers never had to roll it. They died, vanished, and here the rock stands, probably little changed. But it might serve another lonely dweller of the cliffs. I'll hide up here somewhere if I can only find water. He descended the gorge on the other side. The slope was gradual, the space narrow, the course straight for many rods. A gloom hung between the upswelling walls. In a turn, the passage narrowed to scarce a dozen feet, and here was darkness of night. But light shone ahead. Another abrupt turn brought day again, and then wide open space. Above Ventus loomed a wonderful arch of stone bridging the of stone. Above Ventus loomed a wonderful arch of stone bridging the canyon rims. And though the enormous round portal gleamed and glistened in a beautiful valley shining under sunset gold reflected by surrounding cliffs, he gave a start of surprise. The valley was a cove of a mile long, half that wide, and its enclosing walls were smooth and stained. Its enclosing walls were smooth and stained and curved inward, forming great caves. He decided that its floor was far higher than the level of Deception Pass and the intersecting canyons. No purple sage colored this valley floor. Instead, there were the white of aspens, streaks of branch and slender trunk glistening from the green of leaves and the darker green of oaks. And through the middle of this forest, from wall to wall, ran a winding line of brilliant green, which marked the chorus of cottonwoods and willows. "There's water here, and this is the place for me," said Ventus. "Only birds can peep over those walls. I've gone altering one better." Ventus waited no longer and turned swiftly to retrace his steps. He named the canyon Surprise Valley, and the huge boulder that guarded the outlet Balancing Rock. Going down, he did not find himself attended by such fears as had beset him in the climb. Still, he was not easy in mind and could not occupy himself with plans of moving the girl and his outfit until he had descended to the notch. There he rested a moment and looked about him. The pass was darkening with the approach of night. At the corner of the wall where the stone steps turned, he saw a spur of rock that would serve to hold the noose of a lasso. He needed no more aid to scale that place. As he intended to make the move under cover of darkness, he wanted most to be able to tell where to climb up. So, taking several small stones with him, he stepped and slid down the edge of the slope where he had left his rifle and boots. He placed the stones some yards apart. He left the rabbit lying upon the bench where the steps began. Then he addressed a keen-sighted, remembering gaze to the rim wall above. It was serrated. I don't know. And between two spears of rock, directly in line with his position, showed a zigzag crack that at night would let through the gleam of sky. This settled, he put on his belt and boots and prepared to descend. Some consideration was necessary to decide whether or not to leave his rifle there. On the return, carrying the girl and a pack, it would be added encumbrance. And after debating the matter, he left the rifle leaning against the bench. As he went straight down the slope, he halted every few rods to look up at his mark on the rim. It changed, but he fixed each change in memory. Then he reached the first cedar tree. He tied his scarf upon a dead branch, and then hurried towards camp, having no more concern about finding his trail upon the return trip. Darkness soon emboldened and lent him greater speed. It occurred to him, as he glided into the grassy glade near camp It occurred to him as he glided into the grassy glade near camp and heard the whinny of a horse, heard the whinny of a horse, that he had forgotten wrangle. The big sorrel could not be gotten into Surprise Valley. He would have to be left here. Ventus determined at once to lead the other horses out through the thicket and turn them loose. The further they wandered from this canyon, the better it would suit him. He easily descried wrangle through the gloom, but the others were not in sight. Ventus whistled low for the dogs, and when they came trotting to him, he sent them out to search for the horses, and followed. It soon developed that they were not in the glade nor in the thicket. Ventus grew cold and rigid at the thought of the rustlers having entered his retreat, but the thought passed, for the demeanor of Ring and Whitey reassured him. Those are his dogs, by the way. The horses had wandered away. Under the clump of silver spruces, a denser mantle of darkness, yet not so thick that Ventus' night practice eyes could not catch the white oval of a still face. He bent over it with a slight suspension of breath that was both caution lest he frighten her and chill uncertainty of feeling lest he find her dead. But she slept, and he arose to renewed activity. He packed his saddlebags. The dogs were hungry, The wind wind about him and nosed his busy hands, but he took no time to feed him, no time to feed them, nor to satisfy his own hunger. He slung the saddlebags over his shoulders and made them secure with his lasso. Then he wrapped the blankets closer about the girl and lifted her in his arms. Wrangle whinnied and thumped the ground as Ventus passed him with the dogs. The sorrel knew he was being left behind, and was not sure whether he liked it or not. Ventus went on and entered the thicket. Here he had to feel his way in pitch blackness, and to wedge his progress between the close saplings. Time meant little to him now that he had started, and he edged along with slow side movement till he got clear of the thicket. Ring and Whitey stood waiting for him, taking to the open aisles and patches of the sage. He walked guardedly, careful not to stumble or step in dust or strike against spreading sage branches. If he were burdened, he did not feel it. From time to time, when he passed out of the black lines of shade into the wan starlight, he glanced at the white face of the girl lying in his arms. She had not awakened from her sleep or stupor. He did not rest until he cleared the black gate of the canyon. Then he leaned against a stone breast high to him, and gently released the girl from his hold. His brow and hair and the palms of his hand were wet, and there were kind of a nervous contraction of his muscles. They seemed to ripple and string tense. He had a desire to hurry and no sense of fatigue. A wind blew the scent of sage in his face. The first early blackness of night passed with the brightening of the stars. Somewhere back on his trail, a coyote yelped, splitting the dead silence. Ventus' faculties seemed singularly acute. He lifted the girl again and pressed on. The valley, better traveling than the canyon. It was lighter, freer of sage, and there were no rocks. Soon out of the pale gloom shone a still paler thing, and that was a low swell of slope. Ventus mounted it, and his dogs walked beside him. Once upon the stone, he slowed to a snail pace, straining his sight to avoid the pockets and holes. Foot by foot he went up. The weird cedars, like great demons and witches chained to the rock and writhing in silent anguish, loomed up with the wide and twisting naked arms. Ventus crossed this belt of cedars, skirted the upper border, and recognized the tree he had marked, even before he saw his waving scarf. Here he knelt, deposited the girl gently, feet first, and slowly laid her out full length. What he feared was to reopen one of her wounds. If he gave her a violent jar or slipped and fell, but supreme confidence, so strangely felt that night, admitted no such blunders. The slope before him seemed to swell into obscurity, to lose its definite outline in a misty, opaque cloud that shaded into the overshadowing wall. He scanned the rim where the serrated points speared the sky, and he found the zigzag crack. It was dim, only a shade lighter than the dark ramparts, but he distinguished it, and that served. Lifting the girl, he stepped upward, closely attending to the nature of the path under his feet. After a few steps, he stopped to mark his line with a crack in the rim. The dog clung closer to him. While chasing the rabbit, this slope had appeared interminable to him. Now, burdened as he was, he did not think of length or height or toil. He remembered only to avoid a misstep and to keep his direction. He climbed on with frequent stops towards the rim, and before he dreamed of gaining the bench, he bumped his knees into it and saw in the dim grey light his rifle and the rabbit. He had come straight up without mishap or swerving of his course, and his shut teeth unlocked. As he laid the girl down in the shallow hole of the little ridge with a white face upturned, she opened her eyes, wide, staring black at once, like both the night and the stars. They made her face seem still whiter. "Is it you?" she asked faintly. "Yes," replied Ventus. "Oh, where are we?" "I'm taking you to a safe place where no one will ever find you. I must climb a little here and call the dogs. Don't be afraid, I'll soon come for you." She said no more. Her eyes watched him steadily for a moment and then closed. Ventus pulled off his boots and then felt for the little steps in the rocks. The shade of the cliff above obscured the point he wanted to gain, but he could see dimly a few feet before him. What he had attempted with care, he now went at with surpassing lightness. Buoyant, rapid, sure, he attained the corner of wall and slipped around it. Here he could not see a hand before his face, so he groped along, found a little flat space, and there removed the saddlebags. The lasso he took back with him to the corner and looped the noose over the spur of rock. "Ring, Whitey, come!" he called softly. Low whines came up from below. "Here, come, Whitey, ring," he repeated, this time sharply. Then followed a scraping of claws and pattering of feet, and out of the grey gloom below him swiftly climbed the dogs to reach his side and pass beyond. Ventus descended, holding the lasso. He tested its strength by throwing all his weight upon it. Then he gathered the girl up, and holding her securely in his left arm, he began to climb, at every few steps jerking his right hand upwards along the lasso. It sagged at each forward movement he made, but he balanced himself lightly during the interval when he lacked the support of a taut rope. He climbed as if he had wings, the strength of a giant, and knew not the sense of fear. The sharp corner of cliff seemed to cut out of the darkness. He reached it and the protruding shelf, and then entering the blank shade of the notch, he moved blindly but surely to the place where he had left the saddlebags. He heard the dogs, though he could not see them. Once more, he carefully placed the girl at his feet. Then, on hand and knees, he went over the little flat space, feeling for stones. He removed a number, and, scraping into the dust into a heap, he unfolded the outer blanket from around the girl and laid her upon this bed. Then he went down the slope again for his boots, rifle, and the rabbit, and bringing also his lasso with him, he made short work of that trip. "Are you there?" The girl's voice came low from the blackness. "Yes," he replied, and was conscious that his laboring breast made speech difficult. "Are we in a cave?" Yes. Oh, listen, the waterfall. I hear it. You've brought me back." Ventus heard a murmuring moan that one moment swelled to a pitch almost softly shrill, and the next lulled to an almost inaudible sigh. "That's wind blowing in the cliffs," he panted. "You're far from Oldring's Canyon." The effort it caused him to speak made him conscious of extreme lassitude following upon great exertion. It seemed that when he lay down and drew his blanket over him, the action was before utter prostration. He stretched inert, wet, hot, his body one great strife of throbbing, stinging nerves. Stinging nerves and bursting veins. And there he lay for a long while before he felt that he had begun to rest. Rest came to him that night, but no sleep. Sleep he did not want. The hours of strained effort were now as if they had never been, and he wanted to think. Early in the day he had dismissed an inexplicable feeling of change, but now, when there was no longer demand on his cunning and strength, he had time to think. He could not catch the elusive thing that had sadly perplexed as well as elevated his spirit. Above him, through a V-shaped cleft in the dark rim of the cliff, shone the lustrous stars that had been his lonely accusers for a long, long year. Tonight they were different. He studied them. Larger, whiter, more radiant they seemed. But that was not the difference he meant. Gradually it came to him that the distinction was not one he saw, but one he felt. In this he divined as much of the baffling change as he thought would be revealed to him then. And as he lay there with the singing of the cliff winds in his ears, the white stars above the dark bold went, the difference which he felt was that he was no longer alone. That's the end of the chapter. That's actually interesting, the last bit. I think that's very slightly Shakespearean. Not Shakespearean, but I think what this means is that he feels bad about what he's done, like his fate so far, but that he has now changed his fate, like man can change his fate thing, by not being alone, by finding this girl. Anyway, that is actually on the point. It's 4:00 now, so that's exactly 1 hour. We've been reading 2 chapters. It's very niceness, very simple. Next Sunday, it's gonna be earlier. It's gonna be like 12 or something, but it's gonna be uploaded. And seeing as virtually nobody actually listens to this, nobody has listened to this live broadcast. It's just it's gonna be up at the same time essentially. So see you then. Thanks for listening. Bye.